Buenas tardes a todos y buenas tardes a todos los que nos estáis viendo en directo. Good evening, everyone, to all attendees, and especially to those of you who are watching the video stream. First of all, I would like to thank the Instituto Juan de Mariana for co-organizing this event with us, with the Foundation for the Advancement of Liberty, and co-hosting it here in these magnificent premises. Thank you, Gustavo. The Foundation for the Advancement of Liberty is a libertarian foundation headquartered here in Spain. Our mission is twofold. We are a think tank working on intellectual production, and we are also working as an incubator for advocacy organizations on promoting causes of liberty. As a think tank, our intellectual production has a variety of interests. For instance, we do publishing, we do research works, and also we have some freedom benchmark products, like, for instance, world indices of moral freedom and intellectual freedom. We also do research on tax matters here in Spain. Our regional tax competitiveness index was the finalist at this year 2018 Copenhagen Europe Liberty Award. And as an incubator of grassroots organization, we try to help and we foster organizations working for taxpayer rights, for pension reform, and other libertarian causes. But now let's talk about Vera, because she is the main reason we are here today. Vera is a young activist. She was elected first as the youngest politician in office in Russia, and also as the youngest libertarian politician in her country. Her passion to fight for the ideas of freedom is an inspiration to us all. So thank you very much, Vera.
Thank you.
And we just thought that as a think tank, we would like to bring voices that are worth listening for by the libertarian community here in Spain. And that's why, for instance, in 2015, we brought here with Jetlichka from the Libertarian Project. In 2016, we brought Andrés Guevara, a prominent Venezuelan jurist. And in 2017, we had with us Yaron Brook, the president of Ayn Rand Institute in the United States. And then again, last Tuesday in Granada, together with Students for Liberty. So now it's the turn of Vera. Vera was, as I was saying, barely an adult when she got elected to Moscow as a councilor. And since then, she has been fighting for freedom relentlessly. She was also sort of prosecuted by the Russian authorities. She's been arrested several times for protesting and demonstrating, but yet she was lucky in comparison to the terrible fate of other journalists and liberty advocates in her country. Afterwards, she moved to Ukraine, where she led an important Atlas Network project on media freedom, sorry. And for this work, she was cited over and over again, as Gustavo was mentioning earlier, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Spiegel, Forbes magazine. And for her work, for her contribution to freedom, the United States National Endowment for Democracy decided to award her with their most prestigious annual prize. So thinking that people here in Spain, especially a small minority inside the liberty movement, who may have been misled into looking favorably for Mr. Putin's grip on power as something positive and something that we should look favorably as capitalists, we thought that we need to bring a voice like this prominent libertarian Russian here to Spain and to learn about what is really happening in Russia. So thank you, Vera, for coming here to Spain. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Roxana. Thank you so much to Fundalib for inviting me here, and to Instituto Juan de Mariana for hosting our meeting, and to everyone who came. So the topic of my presentation is Freedom in Russia, a Libertarian Perspective. And when Juan Pina suggested that I have this topic, I was confused for a while, because I thought, well, it sounds like an oxymoron. Freedom in Russia, something that almost doesn't exist. So a tyranny in Russia or dictatorship in Russia would probably sound more realistic. But then I realized that I have to challenge this view of Russia as an endless tyranny. And of course, probably tyranny in Russia is something that you think, so you probably think as well that Russia is a very authoritarian country if you're reading the news. So things that you read about Russia is the troll factories, the rigged elections, the persecution of political opposition, the rampant corruption. And so this is what you think of when you're reading about Russia. But how many of you have, what's going on with this clicker? Yes. How many of you have seen this? So this is a rally. This photo was taken a month ago in Moscow. And here you see more than 12,000 people protesting for the freedom of the internet, against censorship online. And that is Russia too. That's a different Russia, but this is also Russia. And I'm very proud to say that this rally was organized by the Russian Libertarian Party, which I'm a proud member of. And as Roxana mentioned, I was the first libertarian ever elected in Russia. And when I'm telling my story, the first question that I'm usually asked is, how come you get elected when you were so young? And well, actually, look at the picture. That was my poster that I used in my campaigning. Imagine a kid like this, and I was 20 years old back then, ringing your doorbell and asking, will you vote for me? I'm going to be your councilor. I'm going to represent you in the local council. And yes, I was a 20-year-old student with no funds, with no big political party behind my back, with no access to the mainstream media and no political experience. Everything I had was a group of dedicated libertarian friends and Twitter. And surprisingly, there was enough to recruit volunteers, to raise the funds, and eventually to win the election. I say surprisingly because we were actually surprised a lot when we woke up next morning and saw the results. And but such was the atmosphere in 2012, and I was not the only one who believed that there was a time for that we were on the doorstep of a big democratic change. 2012, we had massive rallies in Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of people were protesting against rigged parliamentary elections and demanding the end of Putin's political monopoly. And there was something completely unexpected for both the government and the opposition movement. We haven't had anything like that since the breakup of the Soviet Union. We hadn't seen as many people protesting against the government in Russia. So there was a huge demand for, like, a lot of people wanted to see new faces in politics, the new generation of politicians who were not corrupt, who had no connections to the establishment. A lot of people were hoping that the change will come soon. And that's why it was not just me, there were other people who decided to go into local politics and try to make a change from the bottom up. And hope was in the air. You can see it here on the picture. And unfortunately, as we know, the hopes were not fulfilled. So what this big protest movement resulted in a brutal crackdown on our political liberties, in suppressing the opponents, in multiple arrests, in more political prisoners. And what's going on with this clicker? and more political prisoners. But I wouldn't surprise you, probably, if I say that ever since Putin came to power as a president of Russia, which is almost 20 years ago already, the situation with human rights in Russia has been deteriorating. But if you ask me whether there was a point of no return, I would probably name, I would probably say that it was 2014 when the revolution happened in nearby Ukraine, so the people of Ukraine, after 3 months of struggling in the streets, managed to oust the corrupt president, Viktor Yanukovych, who also happened to be Putin's protege and friend. And of course, it was Putin's biggest fear that something like that could happen in Russia. And he would do anything to prevent it, even start a war. And as we know, that's what he did. He invaded Crimea, he annexed the peninsula, he invaded eastern Ukraine, and he started a war there. And so that was a point of no return, because when there's a war, anyone who's against the government is treated as traitors, as spies. So the situation has the post-Crimea Russia is an entirely different country. So if we sum up, so Putin's third term just finished a few months ago. So she became a president for the fourth time in March. And if we sum up his third term, what happened? So silencing political opponents and persecution against opposition. So as Roxana mentioned, I've been arrested a couple of times for participating in rallies, in peaceful rallies. And every time I got arrested, well, they took me to the police station and I had to spend there some time, maybe a couple of hours, maybe to stay there overnight. And then I had to pay the fine. And this is annoying, but not that dangerous. But today they've changed the law. So if you get arrested like this at a demonstration that is not authorized by the government more than twice, then you can go to jail for a couple of years. Something similar happened with journalism. So again, in 2014, I had my article censored by the government when they forced the media I worked for to remove it from the website. And at that time, it was more or less an outstanding case. But today, these things happen on a daily basis. The opposition and independent resources are blacklisted. The bloggers and journalists are being threatened and assaulted. Many had to leave the country. Just for you to have an impression, last year we had over 500 people who were convicted for extremism, which in Russian case means posting something online mostly, or sometimes reposting, or even liking. There were a few cases when people were convicted for liking others' content. And I just want you to keep that in mind when you are wondering why, if everything's so bad in Russia, why people are not protesting, because that's so dangerous to protest. But some people are even more unlucky. So if you're a very prominent opposition leader, you can get assassinated. That's what happened to Boris Nemtsov. In the 90s, he was a deputy prime minister in the reformist government, and under Putin, he became an opposition leader, one of the major ones. He was a leader of a liberal democratic movement, and he was assassinated, shot dead in walking distance from Kremlin 3 years ago. And I saw him accidentally just a month before that in the airport. And I could not imagine that that was the last time I saw him. And propaganda, something that you also notice here in Europe, unfortunately. So they don't only spend a lot of money on brainwashing Russians, they're also trying to influence the Western society. And Russia Today and Sputnik and the troll factories, they all exist for the sake of this hybrid war, as we now call it, for the sake of spreading fake news. And we can take this, the recent Catalonia crisis. So the troll factories were backing both sides. So it's not that Putin had interest in either of the sides winning, it's just that he is happy when there is some conflict in a democratic country and he wants to destabilize these countries. So you can see in a lot of countries in Europe, in Britain, and in Germany, in Greece, like Putin's media are supporting both radical left and radical right movements because their aim is not, their goal is not to advance some idea as it was in the Cold War time when they were advancing the idea of communism, but in destroying the notion of truth and in confusing people and in spreading this distrust in the institutions. And finally, the military aggression that I already mentioned. So the war in Ukraine has killed over 10,000 people. Putin's intervention in Syria is helping Assad to stay in power. And I can continue the list, but I don't want to. Some people are asking, well, and I hear this quite often, well, luckily not often, but I hear it sometimes within the libertarian circles in the West, that, okay, we all know that Russia is not a free society, but maybe that like suffocation of civil society was the price to pay for the economic growth, because we had economic growth under Putin, and maybe that justifies everything that happens. And I need to talk about it, especially. What's going on? Yep. Because yes, when Putin became a president, his economic policies were quite sophisticated. And he, at that time, like in the start of the 2000s, he claimed to be a big admirer of Lee Kuan Yew, the Singaporean leader. And so he hired a team of free market economists to do the economic reforms. And they were quite successful. So when I was first shown that picture, I couldn't believe that it actually it's actually happening, that it's not a Photoshop. Because here you see the conference in 2004 co-organized by the Cato Institute and Putin's presidential administration in Moscow. And you can see Jose Piñera, you can see Ed Crane, the ex-president of the Cato Institute, a few other prominent libertarian thinkers, and you can see the man on the right, Mr. Putin. And now it looks like a Photoshop, but actually at that time he was listening to free marketeers, and that group of economists he hired as a reformers team, they managed to do very important things. So up until now, we still have one of the lowest income tax in Europe, which is also flat. They have introduced the stabilization fund. They have relaxed a lot of regulations for the business, and all of that contributed to the economic growth. That's true. But the problem with Putin was that he believed that, why he admired the Singaporean experience, because he believed that in a country like Russia, you can repeat it, you can combine the market economy with the tightly controlled politics. And of course, the strategy was doomed to fail. because capitalism doesn't only mean unregulated, like doesn't only mean market economy, it also means rule of law. And when there are different rules that you apply to your friends and to all the rest, and different ones they apply to your enemies, then it's not going to work. It won't be a capitalism. And and a few years ago, it became obvious that a large share of that economic growth was because of the oil price. So nothing can be more illustrious than this graph, probably. So the blue line is the Russian national currency, ruble, and the gray line is the oil price per barrel. You see how they correlate, and you see how they both collapsed in 2014. And in Russia, the other thing that happened in 2014 was after the annexation of Crimea, many countries imposed economic sanctions on Russia, and it also added insult to injury. And a lot of investors, they had to take out their assets, and it also and the ruble collapsed even further. And now, I don't know how many of you are watching football, but now there's the World Cup that Russia is hosting, and Mr. Putin is trying to persuade the whole world that Russia is a prosperous country, that to impress you with the stadiums. But I just want you to remember that behind these shiny facades, there is an economic stagnation. And just one number that really shocked me when I saw it, that now an average Russian family spends almost half of their income on food. To compare, in Spain, it's below 20%. So I just want you to remember it when you're looking at these Chinese stadiums. And despite all of this, despite the fact that the situation is so bad, Putin won the elections once again, a few months in March, and he has secured his presidential seat for another 6 years. And does it mean he's really controlling everything? So the opposition is silenced, the Iron Curtain is raised so that Russia is isolated, and people are listening to the television. No one can change their mind. People are brainwashed. Does it mean he's in full control of everything? That his power is absolute and nothing can challenge it? Well, we have this magical number that is often cited in the media, the 86%. So according to the polls, the official polls, 86% is the number of Russians who eagerly support Putin personally and everything he's doing, from military intervention to Syria to raising the age of retirement, which happened a few days ago. And is that true? So is that true that the absolute majority is totally supporting him? But the answer is that no one knows. It's the problem that every authoritarian government creates for themselves when they destroy free speech, when they create the atmosphere of fear. There is no way they can find out what people think about them. So, because they won't be honest answering the polls. And Russia has already had that experience. In 1991, the year I was born, and also the year the Soviet Union collapsed. And just a few months before the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a referendum across the Soviet Union, all the republics. And the question was exactly this: do you want to keep the Soviet Union as it is? And you see in the green cells those who voted for it. So 71% in Russia supported the Russian Republic, 70% in Ukraine, and up to 97% in Turkmenistan. So the absolute majority said, yes, we like the Soviet regime, we want to keep it. And what happened in 2 months? All that support vanished. So Putin seems to have not learned the lesson of his predecessors. And as I said, there is another Russia. And also there are independent polls, and they are showing a much more optimistic picture. And according to one of them, 2 years ago, an important event happened that came unnoticed. 2 years ago, the television stopped being the #1 source of information for the so-called millennials, for people of my age and younger. So now they get most of their information online, which means that the youngest generation is completely out of reach for the propaganda. And because it's much harder. You can control internet, but only to a certain extent. So that rally was dedicated to the Telegram messenger. I don't know how many of you are using it. Yes, I've heard that the Libertarian Party in Spain is for them it's the main way of communication. But proud to say, it was founded by Pavel Durov, a Russian entrepreneur who is an outspoken libertarian, and of course he had to leave the country at some point. Yeah, so no surprise these people are going out in the street to protect their freedom of information, to protect the free internet. And this is the fearless generation, because when I think about it, it really strikes me, because many of them, so people who are now 18, 19, they were born when Putin was already in power. They have never ever seen any other person in charge of the country. Well, I don't count Medvedev for an other person. He was like Putin's puppet. But they have never ever seen another regime. And they've only seen democracy and this political competition either in school history textbooks or in the House of Cards, maybe. But still they know that something's going wrong, because they're global-minded, because they see that this is not how it works in prosperous countries. They want Russia to be a prosperous country, so they go out and protest. And as I said, I'm very proud that this rally was organized by the Russian Libertarian Party, which I'm a member of. The party that just turned 10 years, just 2 months ago. Our first big anniversary, and this is actually how it started, how I guess many libertarian movements across the world start. So we were gathering in a dark basement, like a bunch of nerds discussing books, discussing the authors of Austrian Economic School, complaining about the situation in the country, all the regulations, and dreaming that maybe one day Russia will become the John Galt's Gulch, maybe one day. But now we have this. And how come that in 10 years we have, under such a pressure from the government, how come we've made it? And when I think of it, I realized that maybe the recipe for success was combining two strategies, while many libertarian movements stick just to one of them. So the first was obviously it's not working. Yep. What's up? No. This, yep. So, first of all, education, something that many libertarian organizations worldwide are brilliant at, spreading ideas, debating, discussing ideas. That's what we've been doing from the very beginning. And here on the photo, you can see our biggest success. That's an event. It's an annual event called Adam Smith Forum. We started it almost 10 years ago, basically from scratch, from bottom up. just booked an audience in the university and invited the friends. Now it's the largest Russian-speaking libertarian conference, and it normally gets like about over 500 attendees. And we had very big names as speakers. We had Tom Palmer from Atlas Network. We had Peter Gutler, the president of Cato Institute. We had Deirdre McCloskey, professor and author of many books. We had Vit Jedlička, whom you mentioned, the president of Liberland, and many, many other people. And we are going beyond Moscow. So this is happening in Moscow. If any of you is in Moscow in November, you should visit it. But we also, it was such a success that we used it as a template and were traveling across Russia from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, organizing smaller but similar events, discussing not just ideas, but also how to apply them to the local problems. And that helped us to get representatives in almost every Russian region. But at the same time, we were also knowing that electoral politics in general is very important. So I was the first elected person. Now we have 3 more. So this guy is my very close friend. He is the ex-chairman of the Libertarian Party, Andrei Shalnev. He, I think, was the youngest chairman of a political party in Russia. And he's now also a local councilor in his town. And so when I was in the council, probably the biggest lesson I've learned was that if you don't have access to the mainstream media, you can still win over this propaganda machine because you are closer to the people and you're talking to the people. And the lesson was that despite everything the official polls are saying, people care much less about what's going on in Syria, or in Ukraine, or in America, or in Great Britain, and they care much more about what's going on in their backyard. Whether the roads they are using are safe, whether the schools and hospitals they are using are well maintained, whether the money they are spending in taxes is used on something noble or stolen by the corrupt elite. And if you really care about the same things, so I was elected in my own neighborhood where I grew up and lived. And I knew what people cared about, and I was open, and I was going from door to door, not just when I was campaigning, but when I already was elected, and asking people, like collecting the complaints and then transferring them to the city government. And when you talk, when they see that you're on their side, they are much more open to the ideas. So if you're going from door to door and saying, do you want to read Mises? Probably you won't get much success. But if people see that the ideas that you believe in help to make life a bit better, they are much more open. And so why we need parties in general? I think that libertarians need parties very much, and libertarians need to not be afraid participating in elections. Well, in the Western world, in the Western democracies, we see that many people now are very much disappointed in mainstream parties, and they don't want to vote for the existing parties. They are tired of the same faces of the so-called establishment. And unfortunately, this gap is being, in many places, filled by anti-liberals, by all sorts of people that are like against our ideas, by populists, by nationalists, by leftists, by identitarians of all sorts. But I don't see why libertarians cannot do this instead. It only takes a good organization, and we see in many places in Europe that people are voting for the new parties, and the new parties are winning elections. And I think that's a very important thing for the libertarian parties to remember. And in Eastern Europe, where I come from, well, there are a few people here from Venezuela, and we just had a conversation about like the similarities between Russia and Venezuela. And what I've noticed a very clear pattern that in countries that there are usually more libertarian-leaning people in countries that has lived under communism. So Roxana was born in Romania when it was part of the communist bloc. I was born in Russia. I lived in Ukraine, where libertarian ideas are very likable and very popular. And we in Eastern Europe had a number of prominent libertarian statesmen, politicians, or reformers. Here are just some of the faces. So on the top left, Andrei Larionov. He was actually Putin's chief economic advisor and the leader of that team of reformers that I mentioned in early 2000s that has introduced flat taxes and removed a lot of regulations. So obviously now he's a very fierce Putin critic. He lives in Washington and works at Cato Institute. Below, Kaha Bendukidze, a Georgian minister of economy. There was a revolution in Georgia in 2004, a peaceful revolution, and he became a minister of economy. And there is a anecdote that when he was invited and he was coming out of the plane, and there were a lot of journalists asking him, what is your agenda, what do you want to do with Georgian economy? And he said, everything is for sale except for our principles. So, and that became the motto of the reforms. And in a matter of 4 years, literally 4 years, he had turned the country that was a failed state and the most corrupt out of all the post-Soviet republics into the country that was ranked among top 10 by World Bank in the Doing Business ranking. And that's truly impressive. And he also contributed a lot to spreading the ideas. So many of the founders of the Russian Libertarian Party first met at a summer camp, libertarian summer camp that he was organizing in Georgia. Mart Laar and Leszek Balcerowicz from Estonia and Poland, they were the leading reformers in their countries, and they helped to convert the countries. They helped to the transit from the communist planned economy to capitalist market economy. And on the right, finally, this man, Alexander Daniluk, he's still in power. He's a minister of finance in Ukraine, and he openly calls himself a libertarian. And when I worked in Ukraine, he was the head of a think tank named after Kaha Bendukidze, because he passed away a few years ago, a think tank that was promoting and still is promoting free market reforms in Ukraine. And yes, I mentioned that one of the reasons I moved to Ukraine was that when the revolution was unfolding there, I was there as a journalist on the Maidan Square. And I was impressed by how freedom-loving those people were, because they realized that there's nothing good to expect from communism. So all of these people, they wouldn't have made everything they've made if libertarians would be ignoring politics and elections, and if we just stayed in the ivory tower. So this is an illustration of how important it is to be political and to go outside and spread the ideas. And I'm going to finish my presentation with a story that is that is funny, but it's also very inspiring, because libertarian ideas are also winning in a much more subtle level, in a non-political way. And because people are creating these parallel structures, the horizontal ties, parallel to the government, and that gradually replace the existing ones. I'm talking, for example, about sharing economy. So there are millions of, I don't know, who is using Uber? Perfect. So there are millions of Uber users worldwide, and they are not libertarians. Many of them, unfortunately. Most of them are not. But they are doing a very libertarian thing because they vote with their money for some non-government alternatives that are unregulated, unlicensed, and that are better, cheaper, safer than the existing ones. In London, when the mayor last year announced that he's going to ban Uber, they managed to collect, I don't remember the number, but an enormous number of signatures. I think it was within just few hours on Change.org. So, and the government just stepped back. And I was a local councilor, so when I was in politics, I was trying to reform Moscow from within, to make it more decentralized, less regulated, and but at the same time, now I'm doing my PhD dissertation on private cities, because I also investigating the opportunities to not just to reform the existing cities, but also to create new ones from scratch. And so the story coming from Russia is about this man who is a farmer, and he looks, I guess, pretty harmless here, but still the Russian government decided that he is a major threat to the Russian to the Russian financial system. What happened? He was just living in a village, and together with his fellow villagers, they decided that the Russian national currency, ruble, is very unstable and unreliable, and he introduced the local currency that they used among themselves to trade agricultural goods. And it was so convenient, then soon the nearby villages also started joining that new system. And then the government found out. They came for him, they took him to the court, and the court ruled out that using any other currency other than ruble is threatening the Russian banking system. And so basically the court ruled out that one farmer can destroy the whole Russian economics. And they prohibited him from using this this new money, which he called Koleon, because the name of the village is Koleonova. But because he got so much publicity during this process, he transformed it into a cryptocurrency. He's now going on ICO, and people from other parts of Russia, and not just Russia, are also investing in this new cryptocurrency, and the money that they raised, he spends them on helping the village to prosper. And this is an example of how just a regular person, not an oligarch, not a media, not a big name, can do something to undermine the government monopoly. And in some cases, although the political campaigns are very important, but that kind of activities can be undermining Leviathan more successful and effective than political campaigns, both in Russia and elsewhere. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Yeah, any questions?
If there are any.
Okay, so I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a second. There's a lot of defenders of Putin who would concede pretty much everything that you've said here, but they would argue that you can't judge Putin's regime from the perspective of a Western liberal democracy, because the social context in Russia is so different that culturally Russia is not a liberal society, and they might say that you can point to examples like the farmer who creates his own cryptocurrency, or the 10,000 people marching against internet censorship, but Russia is a very big country, and according to these people anyway, the foundations for a contemporary Western democracy just aren't there, and they think that Putin is basically the best that Russia can expect. So I was wondering, what would you say to people who think that?
Well, once I was interviewed, so I showed you Zaha Hadid, who was the Georgian reformer, and once I was, he lived in Russia and he did a business for many years, and I asked him whether he thinks that reforms like that are impossible in Russia because Russia is a more like collectivist society, and he said no, not at all. Russians are anarchists deep inside. Because in a country like Russia, it's easier to persuade people than government is evil. So you can look at many countries in the world. You probably mean this, like, so there's this concept of like, I don't remember the term in English, like when you the historical path that you have to like.
Historical determinism?
Yes, something like that. So that countries there are countries that are more collectivist, and there are countries that are like more individualist, and you cannot use the same policies in all of them. But there are a lot of examples in the world of countries that used to be at in the same stage economically, politically, culturally, and then they diverged. And the results are utterly different. So one of this example is Ukraine and Poland. After the breakup of the Soviet regime, they had almost the same GDP per capita in the beginning of the 90s. They both were under like planned economies. They had been communist countries for a while, and still in Poland they had Leszek Balcerowicz and his team. And they have introduced radical market reforms, and maybe more importantly, they have removed communists from from the government and from the business. And in Ukraine, unfortunately, it became more of a mafia state because the same people remained. They kept the controlling heads of the country. They just changed their changed the skin, yeah, but so they were not calling themselves communist anymore, but they were the same people. So institutions decide, like Georgia again, who would believe that this corrupt country that is quite collectivist in terms that people very traditionalist. So people in Georgia are care very much about the family, the clans, and who would believe that they would be one of the least corrupt countries in the world within few years, that they will be the Georgian government officials. They are still being invited to international conferences asking to share their experience of reforming. So for example, they've removed all the police officers, like they've fired all the police officers overnight, and they hired a completely new police. So of course, okay, yes, it's possible in a smaller country, and it's trickier in a bigger country. But institutions can change. There is such thing as mentality, but institutions can be more powerful.
Добрый вечер, Вера.
Добрый вечер.
Очень приятно вас слушать. Меня я вас поздравляю, очень хорошо.
Thank you.
Вот, меня к вам два вопроса. I have two questions for you. So the first one is, well, I happen to spend about 1 week per month in Russia because I have a consulting firm which is called Rusbaltica, And I have many Russian friends, which are our age, approximately. And, well, most of them are either apolitical or Putinists. And they associate Putinism with a form of patriotism. So what do you think that we could do to create more enthusiasm around these political figures, which are in the opposition, like for example Alexander Navalny, but are not so well known and are not so popular? So what do you think that we could do in order to create an alternative to the current rule in Russia?
We as who?
We as
the civil society?
As the social society in Russia, and so on. What do you think that we could do in order to create more enthusiasm around the alternatives?
Well, as for the foreigners, I don't think there's much you can do, because like the experience, like history shows that the most important change should come from within. As for the Russian civil society, so the best you can do, the best the foreigners can do, is spread the information, spread the word, so that there will be no illusion about Putin's regime, and so that there will, like, the people who are fighting against it inside Russia will know that they have support, moral support in the other parts of the world. As for the civil society, I guess that it's good that you mentioned Alexei Navalny, because to those who don't know, he was the opposition candidate for the last presidential elections, and of course as an opposition candidate he wasn't registered in the end, and he was barred from participating. But despite that, he's been campaigning for a year, and there was an unprecedented campaign, because without any access to the mainstream media, and like all the publicity he got in the mainstream media was negative, of course, but he managed to, he was just traveling along Russia, and in more than 100 cities, he had chapters that were supporting him. He had rallies in favor of his participation. And in the cities that we couldn't imagine that they would protest, because I was telling about how dangerous it's to protest in Moscow, but it's much more dangerous to protest in smaller cities. And so you can like Navalny or not, you can support his ideas or not, but you should admit that that campaign was a very powerful thing, because, well, the campaign is over, Navalny is not a candidate anymore, Putin is in power again, but those grassroots groups that we now have in hundreds of cities, they are still there. And this is that social capital that I'm always talking about. So these people, they can now proceed doing something else. They can campaign for the local elections. They can create some NGOs. They can fight against corruption on the local level. They can try to solve the city problems, and so on. So so answering your question, what the civil society can do, the civil society should self-organize. There was a very striking research made in Germany few years ago, when there was the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they have compared the social capital in the east and in the west of Germany. Well, social capital means how much people trust each other. So how eager are they to cooperate on a local level, to create like civil society organizations, like non-governmental organizations, to how safe they feel it is to create a business. And it all, like, the level of social capital translates into economic growth and the safety and all other indicators that we use to evaluate the success of a country. And they found out that even now, 30 years after the fall of the wall, there is a difference between Eastern and Western Germany, and even in Berlin, on either side, on different sides of the wall, people are more, have different levels of social capital. So I want you to remember it when they say that, okay, yes, capitalism is creating wealth, but it's also like destroying the community sense. It's creating alienation. It makes people fight against each other. It makes them enemies, makes them selfish, and so on. Because the numbers, they show the exact opposite, that countries that had lived under communism, they suffer from a very low social capital. And because the government was first destroying the organizations like these grassroots organizations, and second, they were replacing them so that people, you don't need to know your neighbor if the government will take care of your backyard. And so the most important thing to do in Russia is building up this horizontal organization.
The second question, very briefly. What do you think that will happen after Putin's rule 6 years from now? And how are you preparing the opposition parties and opposition people to that moment? Because that will be probably your moment.
No one knows what will happen. I never answer this question because are you familiar with this concept of a black swan? So the book by Nassim Taleb, The Black Swan. It's about the kind of events that no one can predict and that change the situation completely. So any democratic revolution is a black swan. Take Ukraine, take Georgia, take Egypt, take Tunisia. No one could predict them. So a posteriori, you can try to find the explanation of why it happened. But before, I mean, it just comes as a surprise to everyone. So the question is not what happens, the question is how to prepare to any scenario that we can see, and that's, as I said, building up grassroots activities.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I have a question about your personal situation, and if you can go back to Russia and under which conditions. And let me explain why, because I was born in Venezuela, and in Venezuela we have also a totalitarian regime. As you know, we had elections last month, and only 8 countries recognized the election. One of those 8 countries was Russia. 180 countries said it was fraud, and 8 nations, including Russia, recognized that election. But Venezuela, just like Cuba, created a law that in order to go back to Cuba, if you were born in Cuba, you need a Cuban passport. This was copied in Venezuela. In order for me to go back because I was born in Venezuela, now they request that I have a Venezuelan passport. But because I am widely known as opposition, they no longer give me a passport. So I do not have a Venezuelan passport. I have a Spanish passport, but they don't let me in with the Spanish passport in Venezuela. And this is how Cuba before and Venezuela now are getting rid of the opposition, not letting them in.
It's better than not letting you out.
Yes. But my question is, can you go back? Do you have, is there such a law also in Russia that you need to have a Russian passport to get into Russia if you were born in Russia? What is the situation, and if you can go back and if you could be safe?
No, there's no law like this in Russia. And I personally, yes, I can go back. So I go back sometimes because my family lives in Moscow. But there are few people in the Libertarian Party who cannot, well, and in other opposition parties who cannot go back. So we have political immigrants who had to apply for asylum in Europe, in America, in Canada because of this. So it's kind of a gamble, and you never know.
I like the Venezuelan passport. No, just a comment. I actually like the Venezuelan passport because it allowed me to go to Russia without visa.
Oh, and, I'm so sorry because I know.
Spanish,
When I showed you the Adam Smith Forum, every time it was such a pain bringing people from other countries.
yes, and as a Spanish citizen, I do need a visa, and it is expensive and it takes time. But as a Venezuelan, I never needed a visa, and because I teach in Moscow, you know, it was very good for me to use the Venezuelan passport. But now I need to get the visa to go to Russia.
I know your pain because this lecture, as some of you know, it was planned to be in a month ago, but we had to cancel it because I couldn't get a visa to Spain. So I still need it.
So I wanted to ask you, Vera, whether now in Russia are there still remaining large longing sentiments over communism and socialism and Marxism ideas in general. Why I'm asking you this? Because in the European Union we had to witness several weeks ago the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, inaugurating officially as a high-ranking EU official the Karl Marx 200th anniversary. So you can imagine, for those of us who have directly suffered communism, it's not an insult, but it's very painful to see this. But it is also preoccupying that in the Western countries, communist ideas and socialism is sort of reviving. It's on a revival wave. And I was wondering whether in Russia people are more open to those ideas again now, if you have Putin in power or not, the civil society, I mean.
Yes, unfortunately in Russia it's popular quite a lot among probably two groups of people, either people who were young in the Soviet time and so they are nostalgic, just because where you're young, sometimes you're more happy, so they like confuse their own experience with the regime. And second, among people who has only contrary never lived in the Soviet Union, who were born after that and who have very rosy idea of what communism is. But the problem is that communism in Russia was never condemned like it was condemned, for example, in Poland, in the Baltic countries. And a very important thing that happened in Ukraine after the revolution, the recent revolution, is that they officially declared communism to have been a criminal regime, and they have demolished all the Lenin monuments. They have changed the names of the streets, and of course that's not it's not a reform, but it's a very important symbolical sign, because in the Baltic countries, in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, they treat the fascist regime and the communist regime as equally tyrannic. And that's very important when you grew up knowing that that was a brutal regime that has killed a lot of people in your country. But in Russia you still see the hammer and sickle on many government buildings. So there is a sentiment like that, but it can be dealt with if only the government wants it, like it was done in other post-communist countries.
Thanks, Vera. Two questions. The first is that I would like to know about religious freedom in Russia and the role of the Orthodox Church supporting or not supporting a Putin regime. And the second is the Putin propaganda in the foreign countries is speaking always about that Putin is the enemy of the Islamism. They speak a lot about Syria and like this. I would like if inside Russia is the same, because I remember that Putin support the president Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov is like a Wahhabi. Yeah. He said, for example, that Sharia is over Russian laws in Chechnya.
Yeah, you answered the question yourself. Basically, I was just going to talk about that. That Putin, his maybe biggest talent is to have a different face for everyone he wants to like him. So for people who are afraid of Islamists, he's an anti-Islamist. For people who love communists, he's a Stalinist. For people who are Orthodox traditionalists, he's an Orthodox and a big supporter of Christianity. And so, yes, Ramzan Kadyrov.
For the outdoors enthusiasts, no? For the outdoors enthusiasts.
Yes. Yes, Ramzan Kadyrov. To those who don't know, he's the head of Chechnya, the Chechen Republic. That's a region of Russia which is largely Muslim and which is known as the most like it's a dictatorship within a dictatorship. It's like Russia on steroids. And Barry, you know, because we made this video last year for Students for Liberty because at some point Ramzan, like it was found out that they were torturing and catching and torturing gay people, because there was an like Kadyrov officially, like he said that there should be no gay people by Ramadan in Chechnya, and over 100 were detained and some disappeared without trace, and many of them had to flee the country and apply for asylum in Europe. And this is all, yes, like you said, that that person says that Sharia law is superior to the Russian law, and I don't know how people can say that Putin is supporting. He's fighting against radical Islamism if this happens in his own country. And the second question was
the relationship between the Putin regime and the Orthodox Church, and the situation of religious freedom.
Yes, so there is a very tight connection. So the Orthodox Church is basically one of the branches of the Russian government. So the Patriarch Kirill is openly supporting Putin and saying that Putin is the hope for Russia. Like several years ago, the Russian parliament has passed a law that prohibits, as they call it, offending religious feelings of people. You know, the Pussy Riot case, the Russian punk activist group who were imprisoned for several years for a performance inside the Cathedral Orthodox Church in Russia. And there were other cases less known like this. And there's the problem with religion, the religious freedom. So last year they were prosecuting the Jehovah's Witnesses. So it means that there is one religion that is superior, and many others that are treated as extremist sects, and plus Kadyrov, who can do whatever he wants in his own territory.
I would like to ask you a geopolitical thing about, just further to what Antonio was saying before, about Vladimir Putin being presented in the West as a big foe of the radical Islamism. But the thing is that there is a strong alliance between Moscow and Tehran, and also the Iranian regime is supporting things like Hezbollah and other radical groups which are intervening in the Syrian conflict and which are the big foes of Israel, for instance. So what is your take on all this whole matter? And then my second question would be, well, Alexander Dugin and the fourth political theory, which is something that we see as something very dangerous in the West, something that has taken the ear of people like Steve Bannon and the alt-right in the United States. And also there are some groups, some small groups of people also here in Western Europe who are sort of paying attention to them. Are they also influential in Russia, or is this just a foreign issue? Thank you.
Yeah, people keep asking about Alexander Dugin, whether he's influential in Russia, but actually he's much more influential abroad. Well, for the first question, I guess it was not a question. It was, so I completely agree. Putin supports whoever, whoever it's useful for him to support. So you can, I don't know, take Greece. So they have this radical left. What's the name of the movement? Syriza, and the radical right, the Golden Dawn. So Putin supports both of them, and both of them, probably Syriza thinks that Putin is a convinced, a devoted communist, and the Golden Dawn will think that he's an orthodox traditionalist, and so he manages to fool everyone. And so at least I want him not to fool anyone who's sitting here. I want you to be aware of that he has that talent. We have to give credit to him for that. And so the second question was Dugin, yes, Dugin, and the alt-right movement. And again, so there is, I've heard that idea, which I think is sort of quite accurate, that today the like this clash, like how to say, the conflict is less about like right wing versus left wing, and more again like more between like people who are globalists and people who are anti-globalists. So yes, there are a lot of, and I find it funny that these anti-globalists have their own global movement, their own global network, and of course Putin is one of their leader and gurus, and of course he's like, there are a lot of dictators in the world, so like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like Erdogan in Turkey, like Maduro in Venezuela, who want to repeat who want to like replicate Putin's success in creating this iron fence around the country, in who admire him as the enemy of the so-called liberal world order. And yeah, he's an important figure for that movement. Although he doesn't have his own ideology, as I said, he's using whatever ideology is convenient at the moment. But yeah, his experience is like he's being referred to as a guru by all sort of identitarians.
The ideology too. The ideology too. Do you want to make a comment? No.
Thanks again. When an internet newspaper in Spain, and I suppose that is the same in other countries, for example, El País or El Mundo, two very important newspapers in Spain, publish some news about Russia that don't like Putin regime. In few minutes, you can read a lot of comments saying you are globalists, you are enemies, is the black legend against Putin, a lot of comments. And I don't know if they are
real people or trolls?
Real people, I suppose that, because the right is of people.
I think they're the mix of both.
But I don't know if it's stupid volunteers, communists and writers, people like this that support Putin in Spain, or it's small professional army of cyber activists. And I don't know. What do you think about this?
I can tell you for sure. I think there are the mix of both. So definitely, yes, there are troll factories, and there were journalists I know who did the investigation. They pretended to be just like young students looking for some side job, and they got into that troll factory. One of like the most famous one being in St. Petersburg, and there are actually there are organizations which main aim is to spread this disinformation and to comment, to engage in like holy wars, as they call them online. Yeah, now they're not only doing it in Russia, they're also doing it abroad. And there is a very nice book that I recommend to everyone who wants to understand what's inside the mind of the Russians. It's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. The author is Peter Pomerantsev. He is of Ukrainian origin, but he's living in Britain his whole life. And he worked in Russia for a while as a journalist. And the main idea of the book is that actually the idea of the Russian propaganda. So back in the Cold War time, the Soviet propaganda had a very clear message that communism is the right way. Like we want to live according to like Lenin's principles. And the propaganda, it was quite dull and boring at that time. So, and that's one of the reasons why it finally collapsed, because people, like, it was like many switched to the, like, secretly broadcasted BBC and Radio Free Liberty, because it was not as boring, because they were broadcasting the Western music, but they have unfortunately learned that lesson. So now they are they don't send any particular message. They just trying to be as entertaining as possible. So take Russia Today, for example, and to destroy, like, to say yes, everybody. So the managing director of Russia Today a few years ago, he said that there is no such thing as objective reporting. So the idea is that it's not that they lie and we tell the truth. It's that, well, maybe everyone lies. Maybe we don't know. We will never know. It's just that we are doing it in like in a more entertaining way.
Sorry, if you want to make a comment. Another comment. You speak about Russia Today. You know, Russia Today in Spain is in the #2 of Princesa Street. You know,
#2 of
Princesa Street.
It's a very, very well
street.
Area of Madrid.
And do you know what is also in the #2 of Princesa Street? The headquarters of Podemos political party.
My question is about Leo Tolstoy. Murray Rothbard spoke about Leo Tolstoy as a 19th century Russian libertarian, non-aggression principle, a big critic of the state. How do Russian libertarians today view Leo Tolstoy?
I wouldn't talk for the for Russian libertarians. But yeah, I can talk for myself. Well, that's, to some extent, that's true. He wasn't, well, not a libertarian. He was an anarchist, and it's very interesting that although he was a very, like, a traditional, like, he was an orthodox. He was traditionalist. He was supporting, like, the family values, the, like austerity, and, like, developing your soul rather than your body. And at the same time, he was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church, because his idea, they were dangerous for the Russian Empire, because he was saying that a person is more important than the state, that there is no such thing as as a fair war. There is no such thing as the military victory. That that religion is not about creating, like, rich and shiny churches. It's something that happens within your soul. And yes, by 19th century standards, it was very anarchist.
There are some questions from the internet.
Oh.
Yeah. Wait one moment. Do you think that libertarianism has made some error? It's been worse, that defending more freedom than progress?
Is it the whole question? Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand what it means. But I think if speaking about the mistakes of libertarianism, maybe the mistake was that a lot of, like, libertarians, they put too much they were mainly technocrats, so they were speaking more about, like, reforming economy than about advancing liberty as a cause, as an idea. So in many countries, well, take Putin's Russia 15 years ago, that if you only deregulate economics, if you only, it doesn't mean that you will have a free society. So that was Milton Friedman, I guess, yeah, he advanced that idea that there is no such thing as there's things like economic freedom and personal freedom, they never exist separately, because if you have well, there was the whole reasoning, but yeah, the idea is if you have some money, if you have some property, and the government controls you, like tells you how to make use of it. So, for example, you have money, but you cannot invest it in creating an opposition newspaper. Then how can you say that you have economic freedom, but you don't have political freedom? You are just no free. So what I think is that, yeah, libertarians should have been and certainly should be speaking a bit more about personal freedom. And that's one of the reasons why I love Students for Liberty, which I'm also a proud member of, because they are speaking a lot about personal freedom, and they're very successful in unfree countries like Venezuela, for example.
Okay. Benito Young Matos asked you if you think that Putin's regime is gonna end soon, in the sense that his successor will be an independent politician.
We already answered that question. That I think it's quite like if we believe in black swans, it's quite unreasonable to make predictions, but it's reasonable to prepare for any case, any scenario.
You wanted to make a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it sounded to me like the guy who asked the first question was trying to get at the idea that libertarians talk about freedom, but what they really only care about is the freedom of big companies to make profits. Yeah, so I wanted to know what Vera's response to that, if that is what the guy was saying.
Sorry, what's the question?
What would you say to somebody who claims that libertarians only care about the freedom of corporations to make profits?
No, that's not what I mean. So.
That's fine. Yeah.
Another question? But that question was if we defend more the principles of liberty more than a utilitarian way. Or something.
Yes, that's a very good wording. That libertarianism, if you put an academic hat on and speak in academic, in terms of philosophy, that libertarianism, in my view, is more like an deontological philosophy than a utilitarian one. So it's not about it's not about the ends; it's about the means. So you cannot you shouldn't defend a person who has created an who has led a country to an economic growth if it was done at the expense of civil liberties and civil society.
Yeah, that because, for example, in ABG they made
where?
In Egypt with the slave and so, but it was on Egypt. Made it. I mean, there have been a lot of progress in the world that have made without freedom. So it wouldn't be legit for us to defend that kind of progress. Another question, please. Perhaps, or maybe in Spanish.
You have a question?
Well, you said that. Well, you just said. Perhaps it will be really difficult if libertarianism or freedom don't make any growth, you know, and if freedom will lead us to some starvation, it will be really difficult to defend that.
Is there anyone in here who believes that freedom leads to starvation?
No, but you know, that's a question of utilitarianism. So I think that it's legitimate for a lot of libertarians to defend it in the grounds of utilitarianism.
For politicians, probably, but my point is that no economic growth is justified if it's at the expense of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and other civil liberties.
Yeah, I would like to know how was your campaign for politicians, because usually in the libertarian movements we start to talk about Hayek, about Mises, about some topics that people don't know. Actually, they don't care. But in politics, you have to be more pragmatic and you have to talk about what people really care. So, how was your experience?
My experience. So, as I told you, it was I was running in my own in the neighborhood where I grew up, and it was because Moscow like. It's a special case because we don't really have municipal government, because those councils that we have, they unfortunately have very limited powers. So the major decision concerning the budget money, concerning infrastructure projects, they are made on the city level by the mayor and by the people who are appointed, not elected. So I didn't want, and I would never lie to the people saying that I will solve all your problems. Although they were like, because many people, they don't know the structure of the government. When I was saying I'm running for a councilor, they were asking all sort of favors from me, up to, I don't know, recovering the Russia's space program and raising the pensions and reforming the education and so on. But I was honest, and I was saying that my power will be limited, but what I can do, because I'm a journalist, I have like popular pages on social media, so I can attract it, I can raise awareness, I can attract attention to the local problems, and that's what I've been doing. So there were some issues where people couldn't, for months they couldn't solve them, and I just brought the big media, and they were reporting about it, and it was helping. I could be the medium between the government who are actually making decisions and the people, because those people sitting in their offices, they're not listening. But I could help the citizens to with this pressure. So I wasn't promising anything I cannot do. I just looked at the list of the powers that that this seat gives you, the position gives you, and I was working within those limits. So, for example, one of the most important things I did, it was because before that I used to work for a while in an NGO that was protecting the right, because in Russia we still have army conscription, and protecting the rights of the conscripts, of this young 18-year-old guys who are taken to the army against their will. And we had, me and my libertarian team, we had that information campaign. So we printed out the booklets explaining the rights of those people who are taken to the army against their will. What do they do to avoid it? And we were spreading them in front of the schools, because people who are graduating from schools, they normally soon they will face this problem. And once a person came to me who was from the local government responsible for this army conscription, and he was furious. He said, because of you, we hadn't had enough conscript this year, because you explained them why do you explain them it? We are failing our program now. So things like this. Yes.
Also, what is the status of the Libertarian Party? Because, for example, in the country of Venezuela, they allow parties to run in the campaigns, but they put really difficult rules to make it almost impossible to be a political party in the system. It was that difficult to run there. Do you have to sign big amount or some amount of signs, or what did you do?
Well, Libertarian Party is not officially registered in Russia too, but it doesn't make any difference, because the registered parties now, they used to have some benefits a few years ago, but now they don't have any, because only the parties that are in parliament are free from this like they don't need to collect signatures when their candidates are running, and these are just 4 parties, and like about 80% of the parliament the members are the members of United Russia, Putin's party. So there are other like registered parties, but they don't have now any advantage compared to us. So it's about how many people you have and how committed they are, rather than whether you have a paper from the government. And yeah, I had to collect the signatures. In my case, it was not that much. It was about 100 signatures because there was a local government. When you're running for higher government, you need more signatures. So I was also running for a higher office in 2014. But I couldn't register myself as a candidate, and me and my volunteers were attacked physically at some point. And there were thugs who just came and they tore apart our signatures that we've collected. And so these things happen too. But I told you, we have now 3 more elected people, and the interesting thing is that. That guy I showed you, Andrei, he became a councilor, and ever since he became a councilor, the local Libertarian Party in this town started growing, which means that what he's doing is really helping the people. So he's one of the most popular people now there, and so you can do a lot of things as a libertarian. You can control the government. Even if you cannot change even if you're not strong enough to pressure, to change the legislation, you can control the government. You can be the medium between the people and the government, and you can open up spread the information. You can help building up this bottom-up grassroots activities, which is, as I said, most important step in undermining government's monopoly.
Is there in Russia any equalitarian law regarding all kinds of activities, starting with the political activity of running as a candidate? Because I want to know, because here in Spain we have that a parity law, they call it, and this law forces any political party or any community that wants to present lists to have a minimum of other gender on their list. I mean, it's minimum 40% of the other gender, and in some autonomous community like Andalusia, it's zipper list. So you need to have 1 man, 1 woman, 1 man, 1 woman, and the lists are closed. So it's very difficult, because there are very large lists of maybe 145 people, and you need to have 72 women and 72 men. And for instance, in the Basque Country, you need to have minimum 50% women on your list. And I don't know, is in Russia the same? Does it apply? Do you have this kind of stupid laws?
We don't have laws like that in Russia, and I think it's ridiculous, and I also think it's very sexist, because people who apply regulations like that, they assume that women are not ambitious and talented enough to succeed on their own without these quotas. But at the same time, I believe, that libertarian movement maybe needs more women. That would be amazing, but of course it has nothing to do with the quotas.